Cowboy let an Apache woman stay for a night, unaware that three more would actually stay too. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
The afternoon sun hung low over the high desert of northern Arizona, giving the land a pale gold color that didn't warm anything. The heat pressed down steadily, but the wind stayed cool enough to sting Thorne Callahan's cheeks as he worked his way along the narrow ditch that carried water toward his cattle trough. He had been out here most of the day, fixing leaks, clearing sand buildup, and tightening wooden braces. The work helped him stay focused, helped keep old memories from circling back. He preferred tasks like this: quiet, repetitive, predictable. Nothing unexpected, nothing he couldn't control. Thorne paused at a bend in the ditch where one of the older pipes had shifted out of place during last week's storm. He knelt, set his gloves on the ground, and ran his fingers along the joint to check the seal. It was still tight, but the wood frame bracing it had started to sag. He made a mental note to fix it before winter. The list of chores never ended, and in a way, that was good. It gave him purpose. It kept him from thinking too much about the past, about the small settlement where his wife and newborn son had lived before raiders tore through and burned the cabins. Thorne had buried his family himself. After that, he chose distance from people. Distance meant no more loss. He rose to his feet with a slow breath, wiped sweat off his brow, and scanned the area ahead. His property stretched far, and rarely did he see anyone near it. So when he noticed what looked like a collapsed bundle near a fallen cottonwood tree 50 yards away, he stopped moving altogether. He narrowed his eyes, trying to tell if it was an animal, a coat, or something else. The bundle didn't shift with the wind. It didn't twitch like a wounded deer. It remained still, almost unnaturally so. Thorne felt his stomach tighten with caution. The territory was rough, and he had seen ambushes set up like this before. Something left in the open to draw a man in. But the shape was small, thin, human-sized. Thorne approached slowly, boots crunching over dry soil. He kept his hand close to the knife at his belt, not out of aggression, but out of habit. As he stepped around the cottonwood trunk, the shape came into full view, and everything in him stiffened. A young woman lay on her side, her breathing uneven, her hair tangled across her cheek. She was Apache, her skin sun-touched and streaked with dirt. Her dress, deerskin with beadwork, was torn badly, the hem shredded, the sides ripped, and the neckline ripped open almost halfway down her chest. The tear exposed a deep line of cleavage, bruising, and scraped skin beneath, the damage rough and clearly from force, not choice. Her legs were scraped, her ankle swollen, and her left arm carried 3 cuts that had dried into dark red lines. Thorne took a step closer. "Ma'am," he said quietly, keeping his voice steady. "You awake?" Her eyelids fluttered, then opened fully. She reacted fast, fear first, then defiance. She tried to push herself up, but her arm shook and gave out, leaving her propped awkwardly with her elbow half bent. She looked at him like she expected him to strike her or drag her somewhere. Thorne felt something twist in his chest at that look. Anger, not at her, but at whoever made her expect harm. "Stay back," she whispered. Her voice was soft but steady. She wasn't begging. She was warning. Thorne stopped, moving immediately. "You're hurt," he said. "You need water." She shook her head, more out of stubbornness than ability. She tried again to stand, her legs trembling beneath her, and her breath hitched sharply when her injured ankle buckled. Thorne stepped forward on instinct, but she raised her hand sharply to stop him. Even now, she wanted to control what happened to her. "What's your name?" he asked, letting her keep the space she needed. She looked unsure whether to answer, then finally murmured, "Sonny." Thorne nodded. "I'm Thorne." She didn't relax, but she didn't look away either. He studied her injuries carefully. She hadn't been lying here long, but dehydration and exhaustion were setting in. Her dress was dirty from crawling. Her hair carried dust from miles of walking. She had been running from something or someone. "You'll pass out again if you try to move," he said. "You need to get off the ground." She swallowed slowly, her eyes drifting to his holster, then to his hands, then back to his face. She wasn't deciding if she could trust him. She was deciding if she could survive trusting him. "Let me lift you," Thorn said. "You don't have to like it. Just let me get you to shade." Sonny breathed in shakily. "If you try anything, I won't," he said. His tone didn't rise. It didn't waver. He meant it. After several long seconds, she gave one small nod. Thorn stepped forward and slid an arm behind her back, careful not to touch any scraped skin. Her breath hitched when he positioned his other arm beneath her legs. When he lifted her, her body tensed hard, her fingers grabbing the front of his shirt near the collar. Her curves pressed against him through the torn dress, her chest rising unsteadily with each breath. Thorn kept his gaze steady on the path ahead, not on her exposed skin or the rip in her neckline. "You all right?" he asked. Her voice came out thin. "Just walk." Thorn carried her across the dry wash toward his cabin. His arms were strong from years of hauling fence posts, dragging cattle out of ravines, and lifting water barrels. But this felt different. Not heavy, not burdensome, just delicate. He felt every tremble of her muscles, every sharp breath she took when her ankle shifted. As he walked, he kept scanning the ridge line in case whoever hurt her had followed. Sonny noticed his vigilance. "You expect someone?" "Not sure," Thorn said. "But someone did this to you. They might not be far." She stiffened, her hand tightening in his shirt. Thorn's cabin appeared in the distance. Weathered boards, cracked porch railing, and a broken shutter that he hadn't bothered fixing because he didn't expect visitors. The place had been silent for years, just him and the cattle. Bringing someone here, especially a woman, was something he never thought he'd do again. When they reached the porch, he shifted her weight gently to push the door open. The hinges creaked. The cool shade inside smelled faintly of wood smoke and old leather. He laid Sonny on his bed, the only bed in the one-room cabin. She watched his hands closely as he adjusted the blanket under her head. "You mean no harm?" she asked. The question came out soft, like she wanted to believe the answer but didn't dare assume it. "No harm," he said. "You're safe here tonight." Her shoulders lowered just a fraction. Not in comfort, just in exhaustion. Thorn fetched a cup of water, the clean cloth, and a small tin of salve. He poured water onto the cloth to clean the cuts on her arm. She flinched but didn't pull away. Her eyes stayed fixed on him, tracking every movement. "You're used to people hurting you," Thorn said quietly. Sonny didn't answer for a long moment. Then she whispered, "Men don't help unless they want something." "I don't want anything," he said. She studied him like she was trying to understand why a man would help without expecting payment. When he finished cleaning her wounds, she reached out and touched his wrist for a brief second. Not a gesture of trust, but acknowledgement. "One night," she whispered. Her voice shook. Thorn nodded. "One night." She lay back slowly, her eyelids heavy. Thorn stepped away to bank the fire, unaware that 3 more women were moving silently through the brush outside, watching, waiting, and preparing to change his life in ways he had not imagined. Thorn stood near the stove after tending the fire, wiping his hands on his trousers as he glanced back at Sonny. She lay on her side, resting but not fully asleep. Her breathing had steadied, but her fingers remained curled into the blanket like she expected someone to yank it away. Thorn watched her eyes slowly open again, her gaze scanning the room as if checking each corner for danger. He realized then that she had not slept indoors for more than a night or two in a long time. The stiffness in her shoulders, the way she kept her injured ankle tucked toward her body, it all told him she was prepared to flee the second something sounded wrong. Thorn took a slow breath and tried to answer the questions he knew any outsider might ask if they saw this scene. Who was this woman? Where had she come from? What had happened to her group? Why was she alone in the desert? Were there people searching for her? Was Thorn safe bringing her here? The truth was, Thorn had no answers yet, and that bothered him more than he wanted to admit. He set his tools aside and moved to the table, giving her space. "You warm enough?" he asked. Sonny nodded slightly. "Yes." Her voice was quiet, but her tone carried exhaustion that went beyond the injuries. She shifted and winced when her ankle brushed the blanket. Thorn noticed it immediately. "That ankle's bad," he said. "I'll wrap it once you're ready." She didn't argue. That alone surprised him. Most people, especially ones who'd been harmed before, didn't allow strangers near their wounds. But she simply watched him for a moment, then released a slow breath. "I didn't mean to come onto your land," she said. "I was trying to reach the ridge. Thought I could hide in the rocks." She paused. "I didn't expect my legs to give out." Thor nodded once. "Happens to anyone pushed too far. You didn't choose to fall." Her expression shifted. She wasn't used to someone taking her side. He walked over with a jar of cool water, handing it to her carefully so she wouldn't strain her arm. As she drank, he noticed how her hands trembled, not violently, but with the kind of fatigue that came from days of fear and running. When she lowered the jar, she swallowed hard. "There were 4 of us," she said. "We stayed together since the attack. We were looking for someplace safe." She hesitated, as if deciding how much Thorn deserved to hear. "I separated from them this morning. I meant to find water and return, but I slipped down a ravine and twisted my ankle. I couldn't move fast enough." Her voice tightened at the end, as if she hated admitting weakness. Thorn listened closely, filing every detail away. 4 women, traveling together, injured, still nearby. And if they had been attacked once, whoever attacked them might still be hunting. He took a slow step toward the window, looking out over the darkening yard. The sky had shifted to a deeper shade of blue, and the first faint stars were appearing above the ridge. Something tugged at his attention, a subtle sound, a crunch of dry grass, faint but unmistakable to a man who lived in silence as long as he had. A prickle of tension climbed his back. Sonny noticed the change in his posture. "What is it?" He didn't turn from the window. "Someone's outside." Sonny sat up too quickly, pain flashing across her face, but fear overruling it. Her hand gripped the blanket as she stared at the window. "If they followed, they're not coming at the door," Thorn murmured. "They're watching." He stepped toward the rifle resting on the wall, not grabbing it yet, but making sure it was close. His heartbeat stayed steady, but his jaw tightened. He had seen ambushes before. He had walked in a trap set by men who knew how to use bait. But this didn't feel like men preparing to strike. The noise outside was too light, too careful, like someone trying not to be heard. Sonny swallowed hard. "Let me look." "You stay," Thorn said firmly. "I'm checking." But before he could move, the door thudded lightly, once. Not a kick, not an attempt to force it open. Just a single muted knock that sounded more like someone exhausted, trying to ask permission rather than someone attempting to break in. Sonny's breath caught. "It's them," she whispered. "They found me." Thorn opened the door with caution, standing slightly behind it in case someone lunged. But no attack came. Instead, 3 figures stood in the cold dusk. 3 Apache women, each in worse shape than Sonny. The oldest-looking one, tall and strong despite a long gash across her arm, stared at Thorn with hard suspicion. Her dress was torn down the side, her braids messy and weighted with dust. Behind her, a younger girl leaned heavily on a crooked walking stick. Her limp was clear even in the limited light. Her dress hung loose around her thin frame, the fabric ripped near the hip. The third woman, barely beyond her early 20s, stood closest to the porch, shivering even though the air wasn't cold. Her hands clutched the remains of a blanket tied around her shoulders. Sonny whispered their names in a shaky breath. "Mira, Tala, Noka." The 3 women stared at Thorn as if waiting for him to reveal what he had done to Sonny. Their eyes were guarded, sharp, and ready to defend her if needed. Thorn stepped back just enough to show he wasn't blocking the doorway. Sonny pushed herself up on her elbows. "They didn't touch you?" Mira asked her, voice tight. "No," Sonny said quickly. "He helped me." Myra's posture shifted, but only slightly. Relief mixed with caution. Tala spoke next. "We saw you fall. We tried to reach you, but there were riders on the ridge. We hid until dark." Noka's eyes were glued to Thorn. "You're not with the men who hurt us." "No," Thorn said simply. "I'm alone." The 3 exchanged looks, each one silently acknowledging they had no better place to go. Sonny lifted her hand weakly toward him. "Thorn, they stay too." Thorn looked at the 4 women, injured, exhausted, frightened, but fiercely protective of one another. His home wasn't built for guests. He hadn't shared it with anyone in years. But he couldn't push them away. "Not like this." "Come inside," he said. "All of you." Mira hesitated before stepping in, her eyes scanning every corner of the room. Tala limped past her with a soft groan, holding her side. Noka entered last, staring at Thorn's rifle with calculated judgment. Sani watched them with tears that didn't fall, only filled her eyes. Thorn closed the door behind them and felt the air shift, the quiet cabin no longer empty, no longer lifeless. For women who had survived things they had not yet spoken were now under his roof. For the first time in years, Thorn felt something he hadn't expected. He wasn't alone, and the reality of that unsettled him more than he knew how to express. The cabin felt smaller the moment the three women stepped inside, not because of the space, but because of the weight each of them carried. Thorn could sense the exhaustion radiating off them like heat from a stove. Their breathing was uneven, their steps unsteady, their eyes wary and sharp. The cabin had never held this many people at once, not since Thorn's family had been alive. The memory hit him unexpectedly, but he pushed it aside and focused on the present. Mira moved first, her tall frame casting a shadow across the wall as she scanned the room. She had the posture of someone used to leading, someone who stood in front of others when danger came. The cut on her arm had reopened from the long walk, streaking fresh blood down her elbow. She didn't wince, but Thorn saw her jaw tighten. Tala stood near the stove, leaning carefully on her walking stick. Her limp was worse than Sani's ankle injury. She held her ribs as if they had been bruised or cracked, and her breathing came in shallow pulls. Her eyes drifted between Sani and Thorn, unsure which one she should focus on. Noka stayed closest to the door, small and alert, her eyes darting around the room. She carried a nervous energy that suggested she had been scared for so long she didn't know how to relax. Thorn noticed the slight swell around her knee, meaning she had sprained it more severely than Sani had implied. Noka kept her hands near her waist, as if ready to grab something if she needed to defend herself. Sani pushed herself up higher on the bed and reached out to her sisters in survival. Thorn noticed the way her hand shook, not from fear, but from the strain of trying to show them she was all right. "You're safe," she told them in a quiet tone that Thorn hadn't heard from her before. "He didn't touch me." Mira shot Thorn a long look, one that weighed every detail about him. His coat, the scar across his ribs, the tools by the table, the rifle by the wall, the way he kept his hands visible. She wasn't convinced yet, but her suspicion had softened from threat to guarded caution. Thorn moved to the corner where his spare blankets were stored. He didn't keep many, but enough to keep guests warm if the cold came fast. He unfolded one and set it near the stove. "Tala, that chair's sturdy," he said. "You can rest there until we figure something better." Tala hesitated, unsure if she should accept anything from him. But her injury left her no choice. She nodded and made her way to the chair, lowering herself gently with a weak sigh. Her shoulders relaxed once the weight was off her leg. Thorn turned to Mira next. "Your arm needs cleaning. If you don't fix that cut, it'll get infected by morning." Mira stared hard at him, then at Sani, silently asking if this man could be trusted with that level of closeness. "He helped me," Sani said. "Let him." Only after hearing those words did Mira give the slightest nod. Thorn retrieved a clean cloth and the water tin. Mira extended her arms stiffly. The gash was deeper than Thorn expected. It looked like she'd fought someone off with pure strength and had taken a blade for it. As he cleaned the wound, Myra's breathing remained steady, but Thorn saw the discomfort in her eyes. Not pain, humiliation. She was someone used to standing strong, and now she had to let a stranger tend to her. Noka watched all of it, keeping track of Thorn's movements with sharp attention. Thorn wondered how long she'd been in that fight-or-flee state. Probably too long. She moved towards Sani, eventually slipping down onto the edge of the bed. Sani touched her hand, grounding her. Thorn addressed the question he knew the listeners and the women needed answers to. "Who attacked you?" Mira answered, voice low. "A group crossing the lower pass. 5 men. They stopped us when we refused to hand over supplies we didn't have. When they saw we were alone, they wanted more than food." She looked away briefly. "We fought. We ran. They chased us for nearly 2 days." Thorn felt a slow burn in his chest. "They still close?" Tala nodded weakly. We saw them on the ridge before sunset. That meant danger hadn't passed. Thorn felt his instincts kicking in, calculating distance, terrain, and how much time they had before someone might come searching for the women. They don't know you're here, Thorn said, but they know you're hurt. That's the kind of men who don't quit easy. The room fell silent. Sonny looked at Thorn, her expression shifting. She wasn't afraid of him anymore. Now she feared what might come to the cabin. Thorn wasn't a man who invited others into his trouble, but now for women relied on him without saying it aloud. He hadn't expected this responsibility. He had lived alone for years because losing people once had taught him to avoid caring again. But standing here, with their injuries and fear filling the room, he realized he didn't have the option to push them out. He set Myra's arm down gently after finishing the bandage. "You're safe tonight," he said. "The door stays barred. No one gets in unless I say so." The words seemed to settle something deep in the room. Noka looked around, then asked in a small voice, "Where will we sleep?" Thorn looked at the floor, at the blankets, at the limited space in his cabin. He hadn't thought this far ahead. He knelt near the stove, spreading blankets and a spare coat on the wooden floor. "You take the warmest spot," he said, pointing to Tala. "Mira, you stay near the wall. Noka, you keep close to Sani." Sani gave him a tired, grateful look that surprised him with its softness. Thorn grabbed his coat and boots and stepped toward the door. Mira frowned. "Where are you going?" "Roof," he said simply. "I'll watch until sunrise. If anyone comes near this place tonight, I'll know." Sani stared at him, confusion and something like relief mixed in her expression. "You don't need to do that." "I do," Thorn said, "because they'll try again if they think you're close." He opened the door, feeling the chill of night hit his face. Before he stepped out, Sani spoke again. "Thorn." He turned. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded once and climbed to the roof, rifle in hand, the desert quiet spreading out in all directions. Inside, for women settled into uneasy sleep. Outside, Thorn listened to every shift of the wind, every creak of the boards, knowing that tonight marked the first night his lonely, silent life had begun to change in ways he still didn't understand. Thorn stayed crouched on the roof until the first streaks of daylight pushed across the desert. His legs were stiff, his shoulders tight, and his eyes burned from staying awake, but he never allowed himself to rest. The memory of the raiders who had destroyed his old life made him watch the darkness with a kind of alertness that never faded. He didn't see riders, didn't hear hoofbeats, didn't catch signs of movement, except for a few jackrabbits crossing near the scrub. Still, the uneasiness stayed with him, whispering that they weren't safe yet. When the wind shifted and carried the faint smell of smoke from inside the cabin, Thorn climbed down. He paused before entering, reminding himself that the cabin was no longer empty. He was no longer stepping into quiet space where he was the only heartbeat in the room. For injured women slept inside, and that alone changed everything. He pushed the door open slowly. Sani was awake, sitting upright on the bed with the blanket pulled around her shoulders. She looked stronger than last night, but still tense, like she expected bad news the moment he spoke. Mira sat against the wall, her freshly bandaged arm resting across her stomach. Noka slept curled beside Sani, gripping the edge of the blanket as if she was afraid someone might pull it away. Tala breathed carefully on the warm side of the stove, her limp leg extended on the blanket. Sani's eyes found Thorn immediately. She searched his face like she needed proof of safety before she relaxed. "You stayed up all night," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "Didn't plan on sleeping," Thorn replied. Mira watched him with narrow eyes. "Did anyone come?" "No," Thorn said. The ridge stayed empty. Noka stirred at the sound of his voice and opened her eyes. For the first time since arriving, she didn't look startled. Tala blinked awake next, wincing slightly as she shifted her ribs. Thorn knew the listeners would wonder the same things Sani wondered now. Was Thorn going to force them to leave at dawn? Was he prepared to deal with 4 women depending on him? Did he expect anything from them? This chapter needed to answer those concerns without breaking the realism of the story. Sani leaned forward. "Thorn, we need to know something. What do you expect from us in return for staying here?" The question hit him harder than he expected. He wasn't used to explaining himself, wasn't used to people asking him about his intentions. But the fear in her eyes, and in Myra's, Tala's, and Noka's, told him that they needed clarity. Nothing, Thorne said plainly. You're hurt. You need rest. That's enough reason. Mira straightened, studying him again. Men don't usually help without wanting something. I'm not most men, Thorne answered. Sonny held his gaze, trying to read him in a way that felt deeper than last night. When she finally nodded, Thorne felt something shift in the room. Not trust, not yet, but a first step toward it. The cabin then fell into the quiet rhythm of waking bodies. Thorne pulled the kettle onto the stove, adding more wood and letting it warm. He moved slowly, aware that every sound seemed louder in a room full of people who had lived with fear longer than he had been aware of them. He set 4 tin cups on the table, then added a fifth, realizing how strange that felt after years of setting just one. Tala shifted, her breath catching from the pain in her ribs. Thorne crouched beside her. Let me see. She hesitated, then lifted her blanket slightly. He saw the dark bruising along her side, an ugly semicircle that told him someone had kicked her while she was down. Thorne's jaw clenched. He examined the ribs gently, touching only the skin around the bruises. "Two might be cracked," Thorne said. "You'll need to stay still for a few days." Tala nodded, her face pale from the ache. "We never cared about pain," she whispered. "But this time we ran too long." Thorne helped her sit straighter and set a folded blanket behind her back. She gave him a faint look of gratitude before leaning into it, relieved. Noka woke fully and stretched her sprained knee slowly. She turned her gaze to Thorne again, but this time curiosity replaced suspicion. "Why do you live here alone?" she asked. "This land is wide and hard. Most men marry or move near town." The question stirred something old inside him. Sonny watched closely. Thorne pulled the kettle off the stove and poured steaming water into the cups before answering. "I lived in a settlement once. Had a family. Lost them." He set the cups on the table. "After that, I kept to myself. Didn't want company. Didn't want to lose more people." Mira looked at him, her anger softening with understanding. Sonny lowered her eyes, absorbing his pain with a kind of empathy Thorne hadn't expected. Noka blinked slowly. "Do you regret helping us?" He shook his head. "No." Sonny watched him a moment longer. "These men, they'll look for us. They won't stop." "I know," Thorne said, "which is why we'll plan before doing anything." The women exchanged worried glances. None of them had slept enough or healed enough to face pursuers. Thorne understood that before they could build a strategy, they needed strength, food, and time to trust him more deeply. He lifted his coat from the peg near the doorway. "I'm checking the area again in daylight," he said. "If anyone's hiding close, I'll find the signs. You all stay inside." Mira frowned. "You go alone?" "Always have," Thorne replied. "I know this land better than anyone." Sonny reached out suddenly, her hand brushing his sleeve. The touch was small, barely noticeable, but enough to stop him in his tracks. Thorne felt her fingers tremble. "Come back," she whispered, not as a command or fear-driven plea, but as something honest, something that told him she already felt safer with him than she wanted to admit. "I will," Thorne said. He stepped outside, scanning the horizon. The morning was quiet, but quiet land didn't mean harmless land. He tightened his jaw, checked his rifle, and walked toward the ridge where danger might be waiting, unaware that Sonny's eyes followed him until he vanished behind the cottonwoods. Thorne moved through the brush with careful, calculated steps, keeping his rifle angled downward but ready. The sun had barely lifted above the ridge, spreading a pale, cold light across the desert floor. This was the hour when tracks spoke the clearest, before wind or heat softened them. Thorne understood that anyone following the women would have approached from high ground, where they could watch the open stretch toward his property without being seen. He headed there first, aware that if danger existed, he needed to find it before it found them. He scanned the dirt near the cottonwoods where he'd found Sonny. Her collapsed form had left a faint impression, and now he saw 3 additional sets of tracks leading toward the cabin: Mira, Tala, and Noka. Their footprints overlapped unevenly, showing they'd moved quickly and quietly. But he caught something else too, hoof prints deeper than his own horse's weight. Someone had ridden close last night, no more than an hour after he'd carried Sonny home. Thorn knelt and touched the edge of one print. The dirt was still firm, meaning the rider had moved through before the temperature dropped. His pulse quickened, not out of fear, but because this confirmed the danger he suspected. Whoever hurt the women wasn't far behind. He rose and followed the hoof marks along the ridge. They stopped at a cluster of rocks where a horse had turned sharply. From that point, Thorn spotted boot prints leading toward the overlooking ridge. One set only, heavier than the light, quick steps of the women. The boots were wide at the heel. A man with weight. A man carrying gear. A man who didn't fear being followed. Thorn climbed higher. When he reached the ridge, he crouched behind a boulder and surveyed the land stretching miles toward the lower pass. The morning light revealed something he needed to know. Thick dust patterns on a distant trail, dust rising in small bursts. Not wind, not livestock. Horses, several of them, moving with purpose. He counted at least 5 riders. His jaw tightened. That matched the number the women had mentioned. The men weren't wandering. They were riding in a line, scanning the brush, checking low ground, looking for someone. Looking for 4 women who had escaped them. Thorn felt a slow, cold determination fill his chest. Back at the cabin, he knew the women would be worried about how long he was gone. They didn't know if he'd come back. They didn't know if they were safe. Thorn also knew listeners would wonder. Were the attackers close? Could Thorn defend all 4 women alone? Did the raiders plan to come here? What was Thorn willing to do for people he barely knew? Those answers needed to emerge now, naturally, inside the story. He descended the ridge quickly, weaving through mesquite and sagebrush while keeping his rifle steady. The moment the cabin came into view, he saw Sonny standing just outside the door, using the frame for support. She shouldn't have been walking on that ankle, but she was forcing herself upright anyway. Her eyes found Thorn first, and the tightness in her shoulders eased a little though she didn't step forward. Mira stood behind her, arms crossed, watching the tree line for movement. Tala leaned on the table near the doorway, while Noka hovered like a nervous shadow. When Thorn stepped onto the porch, all 4 women looked at him as if the outcome of their lives rested on whatever he was about to say. Sonny spoke before anyone else. "You're back." She said it not as a greeting, but as something she'd been repeating in her mind since sunrise, trying to convince herself he wouldn't disappear. Thorn nodded. "Yeah, I said I would." Mira stepped forward. "What did you see?" Thorn set his rifle against the wall. "Hoof prints near the ridge. One man came close last night. Watched the cabin, then left." Sonny's eyebrows pulled together. "Just one. 5 more farther south," Thorn said. "Riding hard. Their trail shows they're hunting, not passing through." Tala's breath caught. Noka lowered her head and gripped the doorframe with both hands. Myra's jaw clenched until the muscles stood out. "They'll come here," Mira said. It wasn't a question, just a fact formed from experience. Thorn didn't sugarcoat anything. "If they catch your trail again, yes. They'll keep moving this way." Sonny turned toward him slowly. "Why didn't you tell us last night?" "Because I wanted proof," Thorn replied. "Now I have it." The room fell silent, but not with helpless fear. The silence held calculation, the kind people reach when survival becomes a plan instead of a hope. Sonny stepped closer, her weight shifting carefully on her injured ankle. "Thorn, you should know the truth. They didn't just want our supplies. They took women before us. Some didn't survive." Her voice tightened. "They won't leave until they find someone." Thorn felt something shift inside him. He had brought strangers into his home, knowing nothing about them except that they needed help. Now he knew the threat tied to them was far worse than he'd anticipated. But the decision he made yesterday didn't change today. "We'll deal with them," Thorn said. "But not until you're all strong enough to move if needed." Mira frowned. "Move? You want us to leave?" "I want you alive," Thorn said firmly. "If these men find you too weak to run, they'll take everything from you again." The answer surprised them. Sonny blinked at him, as if she hadn't expected protectiveness without conditions. Mira looked away for the first time, her stern confidence faltering. Tala raised a trembling hand to her ribs, realizing how little she could defend herself. Noka stepped beside Sani unconsciously, seeking safety. Thorn continued. There's an old canyon north of here. Narrow entrance, only one path in. I used it years ago to hide cattle during storms. If trouble comes too close, we go there. Together. Mira stared at him, silent. Why risk yourself for us? Thorn's answer came without pause. Because someone needs to. Sani looked at him with something new in her eyes. Something soft, something quietly emotional, something she tried to hide by looking down at her hands. Thorn didn't acknowledge it aloud, but he saw the way her breath changed, the way her shoulders eased, the way she began to believe he wasn't helping out of duty. He was helping because he cared. Mira broke the silence next. What do we do now? Thorn walked to the table and placed his hands flat on the wood, planning. You rest. You eat. I'll reinforce the doors and windows. Then I'll scout the southern ridge again at dusk. If the riders come this way, we'll know before they're close. Tala finally spoke, her voice faint but clear. You're one man. They're five. I've handled worse, Thorn said simply. And I'm not alone anymore. The women exchanged glances, not fearful ones, but ones filled with the uneasy realization that Thorn was becoming something none of them expected, someone they trusted. As the morning settled into quiet work, Sani limped closer and gently touched Thorn's arm. You don't have to do this alone, she whispered. He looked down at her hand, then into her eyes. I haven't been alone since last night. The truth of that statement settled between them, steady and real. Thorn spent the next several hours reinforcing every weak point of the cabin. The women watched him work from inside, each fighting through their own pain while trying to understand who this man truly was. He moved with purpose, checking shutters, strengthening the door frame with an extra plank, adjusting the window latch so it couldn't be forced from the outside. He wasn't panicked. He wasn't reckless. He had the steady movements of someone who had defended a home before and learned the cost of failing to do it in time. Inside the cabin, Sani kept her injured ankle elevated. The swelling had grown overnight, and she grimaced whenever she shifted. Mira kept a sharp eye on the window. Tala breathed shallowly, trying not to aggravate her ribs. Noka cleaned her sprained knee with a damp cloth, glancing out the door every few seconds like she expected someone to burst through at any moment. The listeners might have wondered earlier, where the women headed before the attack? Did they have families or a tribe searching for them? Were they fleeing something more than the five riders? What did Sani truly fear? What did Thorn plan if a confrontation became unavoidable? These unanswered points needed to be woven naturally now. Thorn finally stepped inside, brushing dust from his coat. South Ridge is where I saw the most movement this morning, he said. If they track north, they'll follow the wash line first. Mira straightened. How long do you think we have? Hard to say, Thorn replied. They're moving fast. They know you're exhausted. Men like that chase easy prey. Tala lowered her gaze. We weren't supposed to be alone, she murmured. We were traveling to join a distant band. A family took us in after our village scattered. But they were attacked too. They told everyone to run. Sani nodded, her eyes tight with memories she didn't want to share but needed to speak for clarity. We lost track of them. We kept moving because stopping meant getting caught. Noka added softly. We thought we had outrun them until yesterday. Thorn leaned against the table, absorbing every detail. So no one's expecting you somewhere specific. Mira shook her head. No one alive. Thorn understood the finality behind those words. These women weren't being searched for by a tribe or family. They were alone, completely alone, until the moment they stepped into his cabin. Sani studied Thorn carefully. What about you? If they see us here, they won't spare you. You know that. I do, Thorn said plainly. But you're here now, and I don't leave people behind. Sani's throat tightened, her eyes lowering to hide the emotion that threatened to surface. Thorn continued, I'm not expecting you to fight. I'm not asking for help. I'll handle what's coming. Noka frowned. Why? You don't owe us anything. No, Thorn agreed. But I won't let what happened to my family happen again. A heavy silence settled. For the first time, the women understood his fear wasn't rooted in danger. It was rooted in memory. Sani reached for the nearby chair and pulled herself upright with effort. She limped to the table, placing her hand on its edge to steady herself. Thorn moved toward her without touching her, letting her choose the distance. She looked at him with quiet resolve. If you fight for us, we stand with you. Even injured. You stand alive, Thorn answered. That's what matters. A sudden noise snapped everyone's attention toward the window, 3 sharp cracks of dry branches breaking. Mira moved first, grabbing the wooden handle of a knife Thorn had left by the stove. Thorn lifted his rifle and stepped to the doorway, peering out carefully. 2 horses stood near the fence line. Neither carried riders. Their reins dragged across the dirt. Fresh saddlebags hung from their sides. Thorn exhaled slowly. Those horses weren't there earlier. The women stiffened. Sonny whispered, "They're scouting." Thorn stepped onto the porch, scanning the tree lane. The horses were breathing hard, like they had been ridden fast and abandoned quickly. Thorn approached slowly, checking the ground. Boot prints circled behind the fence, fresh ones, leading back toward the tree line. He crouched beside the nearest mark. 2 men, he muttered. They're close. Suddenly, a low whistle echoed from the ridge, a signal sharp and hollow. Sonny grabbed the porch post to stay balanced. They're calling the others. Thorn raised his rifle, eyes narrowing. The quiet land felt tighter, as if holding tension in every corner. He turned toward the women. Get inside. Stay low. Mira didn't argue. Tala and Noka helped Sonny back into the cabin. Thorn closed the door behind them and barred it with a heavy plank he had added that morning. Sonny's voice broke the silence. Thorn, what do you think they want now? They could have ridden past. They want you because you survived, Thorn said. And men like them don't let go of what they think they own. He approached the window, scanning between the slats. Mira gripped her knife, Tala clutched her blanket, and Noka watched the shadows outside. Sonny sat on the bed, trembling slightly. If they find us, they won't leave until they're dead, or we are. Thorn turned to her. Then we keep them from knowing where you are. How? Mira asked. Thorn motioned for them to gather. He laid out a rough plan, using small stones from the stove shelf. Tracks say they're scouting. They don't know how many people live here. They don't know who they're up against. So we use that. I'll draw them away from the cabin, far enough to make them think you moved north. Once they follow, you stay hidden. When I return, we head for the canyon while it's still safe. Sonny's eyes widened. You're going alone? I work better that way, Thorn answered. Tala shook her head. You could be killed. Maybe, Thorn said. But you won't be. He strapped on his coat, checked his rifle again, and reached for a coil of rope. Sonny pushed herself up and caught his hand, not grabbing, not pulling, just holding him still. Thorn, come back. Her voice carried fear, gratitude, and something too new for either of them to name yet. Thorn looked at her, the connection between them steady and undeniable. I'll always come back, he said quietly. He opened the door, stepped into the rising heat of late morning, and vanished toward the ridge, toward the danger waiting for him, toward the men who threatened the first family he had let himself care about in years. And every step he took carried one truth neither of them had spoken aloud yet. He wasn't protecting strangers anymore. He was protecting them. Thorn moved fast across the dry ground, keeping low behind shrubs and fallen branches while the heat built slowly on the horizon. The whistle he'd heard earlier stayed in his ears, sharp, short, and meant to signal direction. Men like the ones hunting Sonny and her sisters used simple calls, so they didn't reveal numbers, only position. Thorn understood the pattern immediately. 2 men had scouted ahead, found his land, and were now waiting for the others to close in. His goal was clear: pull them away before they realized 4 injured women were hiding just steps from his porch. He reached the ridge where he had seen the riders earlier. From there, the land opened wide in all directions. Sagebrush dotted the ground, and a dry wash curved toward the distant pass. Thorn scanned the terrain and spotted 3 riders on the far side of the wash, moving slow, watching carefully, spread apart so none could be ambushed easily. He needed them to see him, but not close enough to know what he was protecting. Thorn stepped into the open, making sure sunlight caught him. He held his rifle loose at his side, not aiming it. Men tracked faster when the person they chased didn't appear ready to fight. He walked along the ridge line until he was fully visible, and then he stopped. Almost immediately, one rider pulled up his reins. Another pointed. The third turned his horse to face Thorn directly. Good. They had seen him. Thorn didn't wait. He turned north and started walking, deliberate, steady steps, as if leading them toward some hidden camp. He didn't run. Running told men they were chasing fear. Walking told them he was worth following because he had something to protect. The riders took the bait. All three began moving toward him at a controlled pace, not charging, not rushing. These were experienced hunters, men who liked to see their target sweat before striking. Thorn kept moving until he reached a line of boulders where he could duck behind cover. He checked their distance. Half a mile. Not close enough to shoot, but close enough to follow. He whispered under his breath, "Good. Come on." Meanwhile, inside the cabin, anxiety rose like heat from the stove. The women had watched Thorn disappear toward the ridge, each grappling with a different fear. Sonny paced beside the bed despite her injured ankle, every step sending a jolt through her leg. Mira stood by the window, gripping the knife so tightly her fingers had turned pale. Tala sat on the floor with her back supported by blankets, trying to stay calm despite the pain radiating through her ribs. Noka held one of Thorn's spare shirts, twisting the fabric in her hands as if trying to anchor herself. The doubts listeners might have asked, why didn't the women try to run earlier? Could they defend themselves? What would they do if Thorn didn't come back? Were they prepared to survive another attack? Needed to be explored here through their voices. Mira finally spoke. If he doesn't return soon, we move. Sonny, stop pacing. Move where? We can barely walk. To the canyon he mentioned, Mira said. He said only one path leads in. We'd have a chance to hide there. Sonny shook her head. We wouldn't make it without him. And if those men see us leave, we'd be caught before reaching the first bend. Noka's voice came out small. What if he's already fighting? Tala looked at the window, worry deep in her eyes. What if he isn't coming back? Sonny turned sharply at that, pain flickering across her face. He will. How can you be sure? Mira asked. Sonny swallowed, remembering the moment he'd held her wrist, the promise in his voice. Because he told me he would. Mira let out a slow breath, not convinced, but unwilling to argue further. Sonny limped to the window and watched the ridge. She didn't realize how deeply she trusted Thorn until she saw the empty land stretching miles from the cabin. Every minute he was gone pressed heavier on her chest. Back on the ridge, Thorn reached a narrow cut in the land where the rocks formed a natural funnel. This was the spot he'd chosen, tight enough for only one man to pass comfortably, wide enough that he had space to maneuver. He crouched behind a boulder and waited. The sound of hoofbeats grew louder. 3 horses approached, slow, cautious, circling for advantage. Thorn peered through a thin crack between the rocks, studying their movements with calm precision. They weren't amateurs. They fanned out as they neared the funnel, 2 riders flanking while the middle stayed behind. Thorn didn't fire. Not yet. He needed information. The lead man leaned forward in his saddle, scanning the ground. His coat was dusty, his beard streaked with dirt, his eyes cold. Thorn recognized the type. Men who lived outside the law and stayed alive by hurting others. Tracks are fresh, the man muttered. He's headed north. One of the others spat. You got a woman with him? Don't know, the leader replied. But someone carried one. Found prints earlier, small feet, light steps, then drag marks. That Apache bitch didn't get far. Thorn's grip tightened on the rifle. So we find her, the second man said. And the others. Couldn't have gone far. They're hurt. They're close, the leader whispered. Thorn felt something cold settle in his gut. They were too confident, too sure, which meant they had seen signs he missed. The third rider leaned down. You think she's hiding with that man? Maybe. Doesn't matter. We kill him first. Thorn didn't wait for more. He stepped from cover, rifle raised, eyes locked on the nearest rider. Hard words from a man who don't see what's right in front of him, Thorn said loudly. The riders jerked their heads toward him. Before any of them lifted their weapons, Thorn fired once, striking the ground near the lead man's horse. The animal reared, forcing the rider to pull back. I ain't looking to kill, Thorn said, voice steady. Last chance. Turn your horses south and don't come back. One of the men laughed. You think one man scares us? Thorn's stare didn't waver. I think one man is all it takes. The leader grinned. We'll see about the... A gunshot cracked from Thorn's rifle before the man finished speaking. This time, he aimed closer, splintering the wood of the man's stirrup, sending the rider scrambling. Thorn chambered another round. I won't warn you again. For a brief moment, the riders hesitated. Their confidence faltered. They hadn't expected Thorn's accuracy, his steadiness, or the willingness to stand alone. But then the leader snarled, face twisting with anger. Fine, we'll bring all 5. Thorn watched them retreat toward the pass. He kept the rifle trained until they vanished behind the ridge. He knew what that meant. The real attack was coming. Soon. And it wouldn't be 3 men next time. It would be 5. He turned back toward the cabin, moving faster now, already planning the next step. If they were to survive, the women needed to know exactly what was coming. And Thorn needed to be ready for the fight of his life. Thorn reached the cabin with a hard, steady stride, dust rising behind him as he crossed the yard. He didn't rush, but every part of his body carried tension, shoulders tight, jaw set, eyes scanning the open ground as if expecting someone to appear behind him. The women saw this before he even opened the door. Sani's breath caught. Mira straightened instantly. Tala pushed herself upright despite her ribs screaming. Noka gripped the edge of the table with white knuckles. When Thorn stepped inside, all 4 looked at him with the same question in their faces. Are we safe? Thorn shut the door and dropped the bar into place. 3 riders followed me, he said. They'll bring the other 2. They're coming here. Sani let out a shaky exhale. Myra's face hardened, but fear flickered beneath the surface. Tala closed her eyes briefly, overwhelmed. Noka stepped closer to Sani, seeking quiet reassurance. Thorn continued. They know you were wounded. They know you were carried. They're not guessing anymore. They're certain someone helped you. Sani looked at him, her voice low. You try to send them away? I gave them a chance, Thorn said. They chose to fight. Tala whispered, they always choose violence. Thorn placed his rifle on the table. His movements were firm but careful, revealing a detail he hadn't mentioned before. His left hand trembled just slightly when he released the weapon. It wasn't fear. It was memory. The listeners would want to know why. Sani saw it too. Your hand, what happened? Thorn hesitated, then answered. Old raid. Years back. Took a bullet through the palm. Never healed right. He flexed the hand once, slow and deliberate. But it's steady enough when it counts. That small truth softened something in the room. The women finally saw that the man protecting them was not invincible. He was someone who had survived his own battles. Mira, still gripping the knife Thorn had given her earlier, took a breath. What's the plan? Thorn spread a small map across the table, drawn roughly on canvas. They'll approach from the south. It's the only direction with enough cover for 5 riders. We don't stand a chance in open ground. Tala grimaced. So we run. Thorn shook his head. Not yet. If you move too soon, they'll track you. You won't outrun men on horseback. Sani limped forward, steadying herself on the table. Then what do we do? Thorn tapped the map. We leave when the sun drops. That canyon northeast of here, the one I mentioned, it'll hide our tracks. Wind tunnels through it. Anything we leave on the ground gets erased in an hour. Noka frowned. We don't know that place. I do, Thorn said. I built a shelter there during a bad winter. Still standing last I saw. This information filled a gap the listeners would have wondered about. Why Thorn believed the canyon was safe. Now they knew. He had a history with it, and it had saved him once before. Mira nodded slowly. What's between here and the canyon? Open fields, Thorn said, and 2 dry ravines. We'll use them for cover, but you have to move quietly and stay close. If one of you falls behind, we can't go back. Tala swallowed hard. My ribs. You'll lean on Mira and Noka, Thorn said. Sani stays with me. I'll guard the rear. Sani blinked. With you? Yes, Thorn said softly. You can barely walk. You won't get far without help. The air shifted slightly between them. Not romantic, not dramatic, but something deeply personal. Sani lowered her gaze, hiding the emotion she didn't want the others to see. Mira interrupted the moment. What if they reach the cabin before we leave? Thorn didn't sugarcoat it. Then we fight long enough to escape. Not to win, just to get distance. For the first time, real fear showed in Myra's expression. She was strong, but strong people knew when odds were bad. Thorn noticed. You survived worse, he told her. You all did. Tala lifted her chin. We fought to stay alive. We'll fight again. That gave the room a fragile sense of hope. Not confidence, just determination. Thorn moved around the cabin, gathering supplies with a precision that steadied everyone's nerves. He packed dried meat, a small pot, flint, blankets, and a rope coil. He gave the women clear instructions about what to carry and what to leave behind. Sani sat on the bed as he wrapped her ankle. She flinched once when he tightened the cloth, but didn't pull away. Her hands rested lightly on her lap, fingers curling whenever his touched her skin. You're gentle, she murmured. I learned to be, Thorn replied without looking up. Once. That single word held a history he didn't share, yet the weight of it hung in the air long enough for Sani to understand the grief behind it. When Thorn finished, she placed her hand over his briefly. You won't lose us, she whispered. Thorn looked up. Her eyes met his, unguarded. I don't plan to, he said. Outside, a distant crack echoed, like a horse stepping on a branch. The women froze. Mira gripped her knife. Noka's breath caught. Tala pressed her back against the wall. Sani's hand tightened around Thorn's sleeve. Thorn lifted his rifle and approached the window, moving silently. He peered between the boards, eyes narrowing. Dust drifting near the far fence. Shadows shifting near the mesquite. Movement too controlled to be wildlife. They're closer, Thorn said quietly. We leave in less than an hour. Sani's voice trembled. Before sunset? No, Thorn said. Now. The women exchanged a terrified look. Mira asked the question the listeners were thinking. How can we outrun men on horseback? Thorn strapped his knife to his belt and looked each of them in the eyes. Because they're riding to the cabin, he said. Not the canyon. Understanding hit them all at once. They think you're still inside, Sani whispered. Thorn nodded. They don't know we're slipping out the back. Mira stood tall despite her exhaustion. Then we move. Thorn unbarred the door, checked the western ridge one last time, and motioned for them to follow. As they stepped into the brush behind the cabin, the air felt sharper, every breath louder than it should have been. Thorn glanced at Sani once. Her determination, her fear, her trust, and he knew what he was fighting for now. Not just survival, belonging. And as they walked into the rising heat of late afternoon, Thorn understood something else. This escape would decide more than their lives. It would decide their future together. The riders came back at dawn, just as Thorn had expected. The first sound was the crunch of hooves on gravel, faint but steady, rolling down from the ridge. He was already awake, seated at the table with his rifle across his lap, eyes sharp and set. Ahiona stirred on the cot, her body tensing before her eyes even opened. She knew before he spoke. They're here. Her hand clutched the blanket, her voice tight. They won't leave without me this time. They won't take you, Thorn said, his tone even, carrying the weight of a man who had decided long before this moment. He rose and stepped to the door, pushing it open just enough to see them. 3 riders again, but this time they were spread wide, making no effort to hide their intent. Rifles were slung across their backs, pistols on their hips. They stopped within 20 paces of the cabin. The leader grinned, though his eyes carried no humor. Morning, the man called. We gave you time to think it over. Last chance, cowboy. Hand her out, and we'll ride on. No blood spilt. Hell, you might even get a cut of the pay she'll fetch. Thorn stepped out onto the porch, rifle in hand, shoulders broad and unflinching. His hat cast his eyes in shadow, but his voice carried clear. She's not yours to take. Not now, not ever. The leader's grin faded. You sure about that? I'm sure. A silence followed, the kind that pressed heavy on the air. The second rider spat in the dirt. The third shifted in his saddle, uneasy but hungry for violence. Then the leader nodded, and the standoff broke. The first shot cracked loud in the open desert. Thorn was already moving, his rifle bucking against his shoulder. The second rider fell from his horse, the impact kicking up a cloud of dust. The others spurred forward, guns drawn. Thorn dropped to cover by the corner of the cabin, firing steady and deliberate, each shot placed with the control of a man who had lived too long with weapons in his hands. Inside, Ahiona clutched the wall, her body trembling. She wanted to run to him, to help, but her legs still burned with pain. Instead, she grabbed the spare revolver he had left on the table, her fingers closing around the grip. She crouched low near the window slit, watching with sharp eyes. The third rider circled wide, trying to flank the cabin. Thorn caught the movement too late, until a gunshot rang from inside. Ahiona's hand was steady as she fired through the gap, the bullet striking the man in the shoulder and spinning him from his saddle. He dropped into the dirt with a scream. Thorn glanced back, just once, meeting her eyes through the open window. There was no time for words, but in that moment he understood. She wasn't helpless. She wasn't just someone to be protected. She was standing with him. The leader fired again, the bullet tearing into the wood near Thorn's head. Thorn shifted, calm under the fire, and lined his shot. The man fell from his horse, the revolver slipping from his grasp before he hit the ground. Silence followed, broken only by the wheeze of wounded men and the restless snort of horses. Thorn lowered his rifle, but didn't relax. He moved across the dirt, kicking weapons from reach. Two of the men were dead. The third clutched his arm, blood soaking his sleeve, eyes wide with fear now that his bravado had run out. "You tell anyone what you saw here," Thorn said, his voice like stone, "and you won't walk away next time. Now go." The man stumbled to his feet, climbed awkwardly into his saddle, and rode off, leaving his dead behind. Thorn stood there until the rider disappeared over the ridge, then turned back toward the cabin. Ahiona was at the doorway, leaning against the frame, the revolver still in her hand. Her braid had come loose, her dress still torn, but her eyes were steady, fierce. She looked at him, breathing hard. "You would have fought them all. I told you," Thorn said quietly. "They weren't taking you." Her eyes softened, the strength in them giving way to something else. She stepped closer, the revolver slipping from her grasp, falling into the dirt. For the first time since he had found her in the creek bed, she let herself lean into him. His arms closed around her, holding her tight, his rough jaw against her hair. "Then I stay," she whispered. "No more running. No more exile. I stay." The words struck him deeper than any bullet could. He had lived years in silence, punishing himself with solitude, believing he had nothing left to give or deserve. Now here she was choosing him, not because she had no other choice, but because she wanted to. Inside, he tended her wound again, his hand steady as he unwrapped and rewrapped the bandage. She watched him closely, her eyes no longer guarded. When he finished, his hand lingered against her thigh, not out of duty, but out of choice. She placed her hand over his, and neither moved for a long moment. That night, the cabin felt different. It wasn't just his shelter anymore. It was theirs. The ghosts of his past still lingered, but they no longer ruled him. She had her own scars, her own exile, but together they had carved something new out of the silence. As a fire burned low, she lay on the cot while he settled nearby. Her voice broke the quiet. "You don't want me to leave." He met her gaze, his answer simple and final. "No, I want you here." She smiled faintly, her eyes closing in peace she hadn't known in years. "Then I am." For the first time in a long time, Thorn Maddox felt the weight in his chest ease. No more ghosts. No more silence without meaning. In the harsh desert of 1881, he and Ahiona had found what neither had believed they could have again: a home and someone to share it with.